Well, Catherine, thanks so much for talking church today and being with us here in Minneapolis.
Oh, I'm so excited to be with you guys. It's been so cool to be with your church.
Yeah, it's been an amazing Sparkle conference and your message and preaching on the weekend. And there's so many things. And those who maybe are finding this afterwards and saying, I loved her message so much and I wanted to listen to this episode. But 16 years ago, your life changed. And maybe you could share a little bit about that. And of course, I have a lot of questions. And I think many people can learn from what God has been doing in your life.
Oh, goodness, absolutely. As a 26-year-old, perfectly, air quotes listeners, perfectly able-bodied 26-year-old girl with no health problems and no indication, no warning, no symptoms, nothing. I had a massive brainstem stroke and very nearly died due to an AVM, which is a birth defect called an arterial venous malformation that I never knew that I had, that ruptured in my brainstem and caused a massive, massive stroke, very nearly died, and spent initially 16 hours in microbrain surgery. And then from there, 40 days on life support, 2.5 months in acute rehab, and another year and a half in group brain rehab. So over 2 years spent in hospital and rehab settings, relearning to eat, speak, walk, and really like live in a new body because I became severely disabled after the stroke. And while, as you can see, much has been restored, much has not. I'm still very disabled today and live my life largely using a wheelchair. I don't drive a car. I have a hand that doesn't work. And as you can see, but your listeners cannot, unless you're video listening, my face is paralyzed on one side, and I have deafness in one ear and near blindness in one eye, and just a plethora of fairly significant health challenges, and yet like an incredible flourishing life. And it's always kind of awkward to talk about all the deficits because I'm doing so well. It just feels funny to harp on those, but I guess I have a lot of challenges, but I don't really feel like I do.
Was there any inclination before it happened that you were thinking this could be what happened in my life, or was it completely, like, unexpected?
Completely and utterly unexpected. However, now hindsight is 2020. Of course, I can look back at all the neurological oddities my whole life and be like, "Oh, yeah, that weird nosebleed thing from, like, all of 5th and 6th grade, and remember how you kept falling downstairs all through your childhood?" And, so many things that and none of that equals an AVM. Listeners, don't think that necessarily, my word. Very, very rare condition here. However, everything made sense now. A lifetime of neurological problems. Now, suddenly, those episodes make a lot more sense. But no, I had absolutely no warning before. I spoke about this last night, get diagnosed incorrectly as a 19-year-old with having vertigo, when in fact it was symptoms then of dizziness of the AVM. And had the doctor as a 19-year-old ordered an MRI, he would have seen the mass on my brainstem. But instead, I was put on medication and sent on my way. And yeah, 7 years later, when my brain blew up, we would know it was not vertigo. That was never something that I had. It was just symptoms of the rupture of the AVM. And if I may keep talking, I would love to tell you, as I shared with the ladies last night, that I think I could be so incredibly paralyzed by that, by if only this doctor would have ordered this MRI, if only I would have recognized these neurological oddities, and then a whole other list of if only totally separate things. I would have done A, B, and C with my life and made these decisions or done this or that or married him or had this kid or moved here, taken this job. Like, I think we all are on this like tragic, obsessive multiverse of sliding doors loop. It's really a tragedy. And I think what I've had to do is kind of really think through that. Like, where is that going to take me? And the answer, of course, is nowhere, nowhere I want to go. But the way out is hope. That recognizing that hope is the escape hatch, I like to say, that it gives you permission to live your actual life, whatever it looks like, whatever the complex specifics, that hope says, this is actually where you are. Wake up. This is right in front of your nose. Get busy living this life because as Christ followers, we know our lives have been assigned to us, and God is saying, steward what is in your hand, not what is not.
I think so many people, they don't have the maybe radical opportunity that you and your family had to experience that. Again, for most, they would realize that's an incredibly challenging thing, but it's almost a slow progression of maybe becoming somebody that you didn't think you'd become in a bad way.
Mhm.
And for you, it was a radical moment
Right,
where you had to face this head on. Again, your life literally depended on it.
right.
Were there times in there where you and again, maybe your husband recounting to you that you're angry at God, you're mad at him, you're frustrated that he would allow this to happen to you?
For sure. Early on after the stroke, when I was still in that first season, particularly for the first 11 months when I could not eat food yet and was fed through a tube in my stomach, I honestly wondered in my darkest moments if God had made a mistake by leaving me on earth. I just thought, you know what? I would be safe and restored in heaven, and this life does not work for me. I don't fit. I'm fully disabled. I can't even eat food. So I'm in this world, of this weird, isolated world, and I honestly don't want to do this anymore. Like, I'm not gonna, I think I kind of want to give up and just go home. Like, this is not a fit. And so it wasn't as much anger at God because at that point, I don't even know if I fully believed that there was a God. Because why would God let this happen? Or why would a good God let this happen? Or what happened here, God? Did you forget and turn your back on me? Because I feel pretty forsaken in this moment. So lots of just complex spiritual wrestling of, are you even real? If you are real, where were you? Are you good? And I'm still, to be completely honest with you, wrestling to this day, and it will be lifelong, no doubt, with the goodness of God and the sovereignty of God, and how that both happens at the very same time, that God is good and sovereign. And I don't have the answer. I do not have the answer to any of that. But I do know for me, I almost felt like in those darkest moments, I was really barking up the wrong tree, if that expression is not too Southern for
No,
you.
I
I am
got it.
from
Yeah.
Georgia. Um, but it kind of freed me to recognize, like, okay, pare it back. So if I was supposed to be dead, if I truly do not fit in this world and do not belong on earth, like this lie I'm telling myself, then I would not be here. Like, how could I be here if I am not supposed to be? And I am supposed to be. There's no replacing me. And God has a reason for me to be here. And ultimately, like, God doesn't make mistakes. And it was like in my lowest moments, there was this, like, I'm very gentle and yet very, like, radical, just knowing deep in the soul that he he is so good and kind that every nightmare of the situation is somehow a part of his perfect plan for my life. Which doesn't totally make sense and doesn't necessarily resonate when you are in the hell, can we say that, of the
Yeah.
reality of your story. But there was this incredible comfort that, like, I don't know how it all fits together, but somehow I know it does.
Mhm.
Like, everything may feel like it's falling apart, but in him, all things are, in fact, holding together.
One of the things that I think is so interesting in watching you, obviously you have many years, but your sense of humor. I think that
Thanks.
for people who go through tragedy and experience this, I find many who are walking through it, they have uh, it's an anomaly of a sense of humor that I think people look at what has happened to them, and even in your message joking about your disability and in saying things and realizing that, hey, I can have a sense of humor about this. Talk about the importance of your sense of humor throughout this situation that again many people can't fully empathize with, but you carry a levity to this that I think is inspiring.
I love that you asked about that. So, one, I think better to laugh than cry, honestly. Like, you might as well laugh at the ridiculous nature of where you are. I mean, I think it's kind of funny. But besides that, my husband would say after the stroke, something, just a filter has left or something, maybe just the near death experience meant that for some reason I'm funnier. He thinks I am at least. And I don't know, I've always been self-deprecating my whole life. I've just kind of loved to laugh at life and myself and just maybe not take things too seriously. And I don't know. I just think people really take themselves too seriously in our world and don't really know how to just laugh at kind of the funny nature of being on earth. I mean, it's funny. It's funny we're here. Let's laugh about it. And I don't know. I think that maybe gets you to the point of joy easier. It's pretty hard to be super serious and experience much joy. I think kind of seeing life as a bit funny makes it easier to rejoice in the Lord in all things.
Was there something throughout your recovery process that was particularly challenging and difficult, whether it be speech or or walking, or what was the
Oh,
hardest part?
hands down, eating. I can remember telling the Lord, like, all I want is to eat again. I will be lifelong experiencing the need for a wheelchair. That's fine. Forget it. I don't need to walk again. I just need to eat. This is so nuts and so horrible. And for me and for anyone, eating is so much more than food consumption. Eating is life. Eating is what you do. It's when you gather with family and friends. When are you ever not going to have food or beverage be a part of that experience? You meet for coffee, you have lunch with your friends. I mean, very rarely do you gather and there's no food. And for me, I was relearning to eat as my son was learning to eat. So imagine that. I'm watching my baby trial baby food, and I can't trial baby food yet. I was behind him. So it was horrific. And then suddenly I could eat again, and it wasn't like eating a steak dinner the next night, but a bite of pudding every other day, move to yogurt. It was a slow progression, but hey, it was perfect. And today, it's not like 100% okay. I still have trouble swallowing for sure. And as your listeners can hear, my voice is an entirely, excuse me, strange. Talking about my voice made me cough. Sorry. Strange sound compared to my old voice. If you heard my old voice, it was much higher and just this kind of low robot sound, kind of muffly. I mean, none of that was there prior, so it's weird. I have two sons, played our wedding video the other day, and of course, me saying my vows is in my old voice, and my youngest son just kept looking over at me like he'd never heard my old voice, and he's like, "Weird, mom talks so different," because this is all he's ever known.
Well, we share a love for kombucha, and I'm glad we could provide that for you here today. But
It's wonderful, thank you.
was there a meal that particularly you had been craving for the longest time that when you finally got to eat it, you were just so happy?
Oh, goodness, well, it's not just one meal, it was lots of meals, and I do love kombucha because it's sparkling and helps me swallow easier, so I got really obsessed with sparkling drinks like kombucha. Um, Strong flavors like coffee, like dark chocolate were huge cravings, all along. But I mean, cheese dip, who can resist a good cheddary Oh, all the I mean, pretty much everything you can eat, I love. I really craved a lobster, like, really strong, salty I'm, like, drooling thinking,
Yeah,
like,
people driving in their cars that it's before lunchtime or before dinner, they're definitely craving
yeah,
something.
sorry, everybody, if I'm making you hungry. I mean, I don't discriminate. I would have eaten and would eat nearly anything, with that level of hunger. It was so sad. Early on, when I was in, like, full-time therapy, I would come back to the house that Jay and my baby son were living in, that they were renting next door to the facility, and I would turn on the food channel and sit there and watch food shows because for some reason my psyche meant like, well, if I can't eat it, at least I can watch it, which is so messed up and like torturing myself. I'm like watching like Ina Garten make some yummy treat and I'm like salivating and it was really messed up. But oh well, it doesn't matter now.
One of the most ironic and humorous parts of your story is the irony of your former and present modeling career.
I know, it's so hilarious. So much has been made of that modeling career. I always like to specify it was not a modeling career, it was commercial print work, which technically is commercial print modeling, but basically it was like I was in advertisements for
I
I
mean, you
mean,
showed the picture and it looked professional, it looked pretty good.
it
Yeah.
was professional because I lived in Los Angeles, so especially then it was great and really, like, wholesome and fun and a great little way to pay bills in law school, but it definitely wasn't, like, my calling in life or something, but it did continue after I had my baby because he would be booked on modeling gigs with me, which is really cool, but then obviously that would end when I have the massive stroke, nearly die, have a paralyzed face, am in a wheelchair. But that's when the American Stroke Association ended up calling me and hiring me to be the face of their FAST campaign, FAST, where the F in FAST is for face. And I'm the face because this is an awareness campaign preventing strokes in young people.
And
Pretty crazy.
that ended up being seen more than any of your other.
Times 10,000. Yes. I mean, billboards in Times Square, on the sides of buses, and doctors' offices all over America. Actually, last night in the book line at your church, a lady said, what was it? She's like, I've been a nurse in a doctor's office and been giving out pamphlets about young people having strokes for 10 years. Never knew that's your face I've been giving out. So they have it right here in Minneapolis.
Well, it's ironic, but I think it is, kind of the beauty of God, right?
Oh my goodness, isn't it?
He has
And
a sense of humor.
well, yes, he does, and it's totally the upside down kingdom. But of course, as a disabled woman with a paralyzed face, I would get a modeling gig, the best ever, most successful. I mean, that is pretty nuts.
It is crazy. It is
Yeah,
crazy, but
I know.
it's I don't know, it's just it makes you smile because it's the way that God works is never a way we could have planned it or dreamed it up. And yeah, I think it'd be understandable for people who experience something like you do, who just normal life is difficult, maybe more difficult than people even see on the surface. What made you want to say, all right, now I'm going to make it even more difficult and I'm going to travel and speak?
Good question. It just kinda happened to me, to be totally honest. I just started everyone always asks, "How did you get started speaking and writing?" And I'm like, "It's about as uncool as you can get." I would volunteer to speak and share at MOPS groups or sweet women's groups or Bible studies or just little things here and there. And one thing just kind of led to another. I was on this amazing speaking team just a few years after my stroke called Seasons, and really just learning how to tell my story. And just one thing led to another from there. A publisher was in the audience at the conference and offered me a book deal. So it's just, again, an unrelatable nut story. But here's what is highly relatable: me telling my story to empathetic listeners changed my brain. Like research shows, neuroscience shows that when we tell our story to an empathetic listener, it changes how we feel about our story. So, starting in 2010, I started sharing my story to strangers constantly. I mean, every MOPS group in West LA heard my story, and that did something to my brain. I really think it did. Very early on after the stroke, I started just changing, creating new neural pathways and experiencing a type of healing that totally the Holy Spirit enabled through that just sharing and just me being vulnerable.
Do you think that, or when do you think that it clicked for you that maybe this is actually the life that God wanted me to live?
Good question. So early on after the stroke, I have a moment. Um, I was in I was in the group rehab, but in my housing in the group rehab where I had a roommate who just hated me because she'd lost her mind truly, and she required a wall to be put in our room so she didn't have to look at me, and it was just so sad, and I couldn't eat, I couldn't walk, and this very scary roommate was just haunting me at night. I couldn't sleep, and they would wake me up in
This was in
the
the hospital?
this was in the group
Okay,
rehab. So
got it.
after about 7 months, I would be in a group rehab setting for that next year and a half. And they would wake me up in the morning, strip me, take me in a wheelchair nude to the showers to shower me. Is this too much for your
No,
listeners? I'm
you're
so
great.
sorry. Just being real. And it was as awful and undignifying and just, I mean, tragic. And those very, very dark days, um, that's when I really started to think like, "Oh, this is a nightmare. I cannot live this way." And my tube was infected at one point in my stomach, and it was just so dark and horrible, and, I mean, no friends in the rehab. Most have lost the ability cognitively to be social, to initiate. I mean, it was tragic, and I was so lonely. It was my baby is, like, 2 miles away growing up without mom. I mean, it was and I had 8 hours of therapy a day, and it was so bad. I can remember just looking at the wall in our room one night, late one night, and my roommate had thankfully finally fallen asleep, and I just remember sighing this huge relief, and I just remember looking up and being like, "Lord, this is so awful that I know you have something so incredible for me that you have chosen me for this. Because it is such a nightmare that I have to know this is somehow a part of something really good. Because I can't believe I'm here. Nothing in my entire life would have led to this moment of wondering. I also felt almost unsafe. It felt dangerous to me to be with this woman who lost her mind, and there's one therapist in the wing of the hospital, and it was terrifying and paralyzing and atrocious. And yet I knew I was like, Lord, this is the kind of low that equals something really powerful is on the other side. So I think that's when I knew.
So, what has suffering taught you about God, the character of Jesus, your relationship with him? I mean, we know that Jesus is the son of suffering, and he
Yeah,
experienced suffering that none of us will ever be able to comprehend.
right.
But you mentioned something in your message. You said maybe God protected me from a perfect life.
Mhm.
Explain that.
God spared me from a perfect life. And I know that's silly to say perfect. My life was not perfect before, and it wouldn't have been perfect if I never had a stroke. But I think you know what I mean. That God spared me from an easy life, maybe a life where I wouldn't have needed Him so much. Um, what has suffering taught me? Suffering has definitely given me a different understanding of just the camaraderie with Jesus. I mean, he was in Isaiah, the man of sorrows, and the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept, and I guess I really glossed over that before. I think many times in American Christianity, in the Western world, Christian faith, we really gloss over the sadness that Jesus experienced on earth and the deep loss, not just the death, but like the major just I mean, he can empathize with what we're dealing with. He was human, and just the sufferings of Jesus are just this camaraderie, and I wouldn't have felt that before. I also think the comfort of him would not be as tangible as it is now. I don't feel alone. I don't know how much I did before. I mean, it's really hard because they say your brain forms fully when you're 25. Well, I had the stroke weeks after my 26th birthday, so it's a little hard to know chicken or the egg. But I definitely think like I don't remember feeling so known as I do now. And that's such a beautiful part of just this life in a wheelchair, super dependent on wonderful people around me, is that the Lord is just so with me in all of it. I just feel a very much a sense of you are not alone, Catherine. And I don't remember those feelings before of like God is just so here and taking care of me.
Mhm.
I'm sorry I'm crying so
No,
much.
you don't need to
I
be
always
sorry.
am. You're asking good questions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the realness of it all, and I mean, I think that even 16 years later, there's still things that I'm sure that you walk through and you battle with, and I mean, I just think this idea of suffering is something as American Christians specifically, we've had it pretty good for a while in terms of just from our faith being
Yeah,
maybe prominent, and no doubt does that not underplay challenges that individuals have had, but just overall the church has had a pretty strong run, you
right.
know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah, to never mind. Go
yeah,
ahead.
but if when we start to see, maybe resistance or maybe people that are thinking the church is struggling, and this idea of suffering is that it's a punishment, right? It's this punishment for
Mm,
sin, or it's a punishment for all of this, and as you read the Gospels, as you read Paul, as you read Jesus, you realize, yes, suffering in eternity, that's obviously not what we're after, but suffering here on this earth, it brings us closer to Jesus, and kind of the final question I have is maybe something that was you didn't drill in on it in your message, but I'd be curious. Like you mentioned 1 in 10,000 maybe in your marriage, the likelihood of it surviving,
mm.
and then to see the photo of your family, your two boys, and your husband. Talk about that and maybe how that has shown you more of God's grace. But again, your husband's not here to share, but I'm sure there's been lessons he's shared with you that you've even seen, whether he's told you or not, about this sacrificial love that maybe isn't what you expected. Maybe it wasn't what he expected when you said "I do" when you were speaking in, again, the voice that your youngest has never heard. Um, Talk about that.
Well, what Jay would be quick to say is that he didn't sign up for this, and I didn't sign up for it either. And I didn't sign up for the 10,000 issues about him I didn't know, and he didn't sign up for the 10,000 issues about me I didn't know. And the reality is, every single one of us marry a stranger. We can know them so well, but the reality is your marriage. I mean, I think that research shows that your marriage in the course of a lifetime, if you are to stay married, goes through like so many cycles that you're married to a stranger many times. That you wake up one day and say, like, wait, you've changed very dramatically from when you were 25 years ago. And maybe we've had that fast forwarded in some ways, that our life has looked different than most young couples. And yet, my therapist would say that there is such a thing as healthy trauma bonding. You hear trauma bonding used very negatively, but sometimes there is a trauma bonding that can happen when you're young that means you have the ability to let the big little stuff go. keep the important things the important things. You get this tremendous perspective when you're young that informs the way you live the rest of your life. We don't get so mad at each other about little things. That's weird, that's annoying, but I'm going to let it go. And that's a little bit how we live. And it's easy for me to say, like, we're doing awesome. We'd have to ask Jay, but we're about to celebrate 20 years of marriage. So we are definitely hanging in there for a story that's complex. It's not one note. It's not like the only thing that ever happened to us was I had a stroke. We've had challenges. I mean, we brought stuff into marriage that's challenging. We brought all the fun, family of origin, all the things. Every couple does.
Mhm.
And we've navigated them, but they say post-traumatic stress is entirely real. PTSD is a very clearly accepted cultural phenomenon. And yet, equally real is PTG, post traumatic growth syndrome, that people grow from the trauma they've experienced. And many times don't just go back to baseline of where they were, aren't just resilient, but in fact grow because of what's happened to them. It's just such a beautiful picture of the gospel, in my opinion, that truly dead things create new things, that, suffering forms us into new people for sure. But Jesus in our suffering forms us into new creations. And a new creation in a marriage can be like you married a stranger and you can't stand it and you're out. But it can also mean learning to love a stranger and cherishing that they are who the Lord has called you to be locked onto for life. And of course, I'm not remotely saying, caveat, domestic abuse situations or toxic, horrible things, Christian people, hear me. But there's a commitment, a covenant that has happened when you're married, and you can learn to love a stranger.
Well, it's clear that you have experience podcasting because if you were a pilot, that would be quite a bit the smoothest landing ever in this episode as you've landed in your thoughts. And I just want to say thank you for being with us, for sharing your story, for being vulnerable, but also just bringing a joy in suffering that I think many envy in your life. And it's, again, maybe they wouldn't wish that the same thing happened to them, as of course I know you would maybe say the same, but the way you handle this is inspiring to me, to those listening, and I think teaches us a lot about who Jesus is. And so thank you for chatting with us today, and would love to point people who say, okay, I this interview was not enough, I want to hear you more. Where can people go to hear more from you?
Okay, I'll answer that, but then I got to say something before we turn off
Okay,
the
okay.
mic. Um, so I have a podcast called the Good Hard Story Podcast, and if people are interested, Hope Heals was our first book and is our website and all socials. Second book was Suffer Strong, and our most recent offering is called Treasures in the Dark. Okay, what I was going to say is you have no notes and off the top of your head are asking incredibly important, thoughtful, super just insightful, tracking astute questions. Unfortunately, I have been on the recipient end of a lot of podcasting that is not this level, and you are excellent. So keep going. You're doing a great job.
Well, thank you. I can't say more than that. So thanks for ending the podcast
Yeah.
that way, and I look forward to the next time we get to chat.
Oh, thanks. Bye.